Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind.
Hello, today is October 9th, 2013, and this is this week's episode. I'm Jason Ross. I'll be hosting today, joined in the studio by Cody Jones and, as always, Lyndon LaRouche.
So, what I want to get into, and just use a couple of quotes to flesh this out, is the way this was being approached in the early phases of the quantum physical revolution by the associates of people like Max Planck and Einstein, namely those involved in Gestalt psychology, namely Köhler, Wolfgang Köhler, who was one of the founders of Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology, this is the idea of understanding wholes. You know, how does the mind generate wholes out of what often seem to be maybe discrete pieces? But the mind does not operate in terms of pairwise interaction of discrete pieces. The mind operates according to wholes, ideas. And that was the approach that Max Planck and others saw was necessary to really understanding what's happening in the quantum physical domain, that we had to go to the domain of mind. And so I'll just use a couple of quotes here just to give you an idea of this was the direction that physics and science was headed in. And of course, this is the direction that people like Bohr and really under the control of people like Bertrand Russell attacked, because this completely flies in the face of your standard Newtonian reductionist approach to physics. So here's an initial quote just to give you an idea of that this is where things were headed. So this is a quote from Wolfgang Köhler, later in his life, a speech he was giving at the American Psychological Association meeting in the United States whenever he was the president. So in discussing some of the breakthroughs that have been made in the domain of Gestalt psychology, he says, "Incidentally, others were no less interested in this new reading than we were. These other people were eminent physicists. Max Planck once told me that he expected our approach, the approach in Gestalt psychology, to clarify a difficult issue which had just arisen in quantum physics, if not the concept of the quantum itself." So here's Köhler saying Planck, who, it should be noted, Köhler was at one time a student of Max Planck's. He studied field theory under Planck, and Köhler often applied as analogy the principles of field theory, where you get these kinds of coherent kinds of processes, often apply that in analogy to what's occurring in the mind, and then also tried to use that to develop his idea of what he called isomorphism. Isomorphism being the idea that the substrate of mind, so he's looking at the brain, saying so the substrate should necessarily manifest itself in a way which reflects the higher process of mind. That the substrate shouldn't be operating according to very, completely different characteristics in the mind itself. That there should be some sort of, in a sense, projection going on. That the mind and the processes and characteristics of mind should have a projection into the substrate. And so and he often used field theory as a way to kind of model or as analogy to this kind of process of isomorphism. So here you have Köhler saying that Max Planck, who obviously the founder, in a sense, of quantum physics, the one who discovered the quantization of energy and everything else, telling Köhler, a psychologist, that he thought his approach to Gestalt psychology might lead to the resolution of many of these fundamental paradoxes that come up in quantum physics. Paradoxes of wave-particle duality, coherence, things of this sort. So it's very interesting that that's Max Planck saying, I think you're on the right track here. Mind is the approach. And you'll see Planck even gets more explicit with this. So here's just another example, another quote from Curler referring to this directionality that was potentially taking hold in the domain of physics. So here's another quote from Curler from a piece called Psychology and Physiology of the Brain. So Curler says, until recently, physicists have not laid so much stress upon functional wholes, or Gestalten, as we have done in our attempts to bring psychological experience into intimate relation with the physiology of the brain. That's his isomorphism. But 20 years ago, there was an intimation of a new point of view in physics. It came in a statement by Planck, the author of the quantum theory, who said in a lecture at Columbia University that in all applications of the principle of entropy, we have before us functional wholes, the conduct of which cannot be deduced from the conduct of the molecules. And he added casually that the same theoretical situation prevails almost everywhere in mental life. 10 years afterwards, I tried to prove the same for those physical systems whose behavior, apart from entropy, is essentially determined by so-called dynamic laws. As physicists were then too much occupied with the development of models of the atom, they did not take account of these investigations. During the last 4 years, however, we have been witness to a surprising revolution among the physicists in their manner of thinking. In view of this sudden development, I would criticize my own attempts at Gestalt physics as having been too timid rather than too bold. A few months ago in a powerful paper, Schrödinger stated quite definitely that problems of modern dynamics are problems of Gestalt dynamics. That is, dynamics of functional wholes. Again, in 1929, Planck declared that, quote, in modern mechanics, merely local relations are not sufficient for a formulation of the laws of motion. We do not obtain an adequate formulation of the laws until we regard the physical systems as a whole. It has been shown that the quantum theory must be applied not to the single atoms of a crystal, but to the crystal as a whole. And so again, you have Curler reflecting on what was potentially a real revolutionary direction in physics. The idea that we're going to apply principles of mind, insights into mind, to physical processes. This idea of looking at wholes. What's the topology, what's the dynamics of the whole to understand the process? And moving away from this idea of Newtonian single particle interactions. And so just to really top it off, here now is a quote from Planck himself, which I think is, for many people who have a standard textbook idea of Planck, this in fact should actually blow your mind. So this is a quote from Planck that, from a speech that he gave in Florence in 1944. So he says, "Gentlemen, as a physicist who devoted his whole life to the sober science, the study of matter, I'm surely free from the suspicion of being taken as a Schwarmgeist," which I think is a kind of like a mystic or something of that sort. So I'm free of being taken as a Schwarmgeist. And so I say of my research of the atom, there is no matter as such. All matter arises and exists only by a force which brings the atomic particles in motion and keeps them together as the tiniest solar systems of the universe. But as there is neither an intelligent force nor an eternal force in the whole universe, this is the long-awaited perpetual motion which the humanity failed to reinvent. We must assume a conscious, intelligent mind behind this force. The spirit is the basis of all matter. not visible, but ephemeral matter is the real, the true, the substantial. Because matter would not persist at all without spirit. But the invisible, immortal spirit is the truth. However, since mind by itself likewise cannot exist, rather every spirit belongs to a being. We must necessarily assume spiritual beings. However, since spiritual beings cannot exist of themselves, but must be created, so I do not hesitate to call this mysterious creator, as have all the civilized nations of the earth of earlier millennia, God. With that comes the physicist who has to deal with matter, from the kingdom of substance into the realm of the spirit. And with that, our task is over, and our research must continue in the hands of philosophy. The more laws are revealed to us, the more forces, powers reveal themselves to us, the greater the reverence for a force, power that is behind everything. And so that's Planck, towards the end of his his life in physics, saying that if we really want to understand what's happening in matter at the material level, we have to go to the domain of mind, of spirit, as he calls it. Which you see is very coherent with what Curler was saying about why Planck was so adamant about pushing this Gestalt psychological approach to understanding physics, particularly as these paradoxes were arising in quantum physics. That really the only way we were going to understand this or get a grasp on it was to go to the domain of mind, which, as Lynn has recently written in his new paper he's working on and has continued to emphasize, is the domain of irony, right? Is the domain of metaphor. Mm-hmm. That if we really want to understand what's occurring in the physical universe, we want to understand the processes which are driving the fusion process and the kind of characteristics of it, we have to go to the domain of mind, the domain of irony and metaphor, which then, of course, takes us into the world of the artistic, the classical artistic domain. And so I'll just leave it off there and see if we have some discussion here.
I'm working on a somewhat different approach to this matter. I got into this business in the early 1970s when some of us were suddenly assembled in Manhattan on the east side of Manhattan. And we had a meeting of the Fusion Energy Foundation. It was the creation of that thing at that point. And we went through a lot of experiences in that period, those few years especially, in particular, all the way into a later part of the year, into the end of the 1980s. But one thing I learned from that is don't try to adduce results from given phenomena. What we used in that time there was energy flux density. And the very use of energy flux density, which came largely from the whole business of the development of the new physics, became for us the most important rule, at least of our association. Mm-hmm. The energy flux density, reduce everything to energy flux density as a talking point, as a point from which you make references. And this simplified a lot of things for us. It made clear, got rid of the garbage out of the way, because instead of having all these different kinds of particles floating around, you had a unifying concept. And the idea was to try to develop a unifying concept, which came really out of the whole development of the nuclear physics. Mm-hmm. That became that form. Instead of being particle-oriented, it was energy flux density. But that's not enough. That's the problem. It's not enough. If we want to deal with this universe, that's not sufficient. We've got to change the way we think.
Yeah.
And we've got to understand this mind-matter problem. And this is where the problem lies. And the way we're going to learn that, we're going to learn it in part from Shakespeare. We're going to learn it from the principles of drama. That how can you influence history? How can you affect permanent changes which is what we do, in drama. We introduce permanent changes in the solar system, within our solar system, within our experience. And we then learn that what we think we are is not what we are. We try to say that we are developing these capabilities in terms of our predisposed sense of what production is, what reality is, what contact is. No, we have to go into a different level. We have to go to the level of, just as we will with drama. Shakespeare, for example, I use that, Henry V. Mm-hmm. And that is a perfect demonstration of this principle. The chorus principle is a perfect example of exactly what we're dealing with. Chorus is not a device. It's not just something of the dramatic stage. Chorus involves a concept of a principle. You have all these nuts out there in the players. And then there comes one guy, the chorus, typified by the ancient Greek chorus conception, and that's used by Shakespeare as an instrument to explain things. And what that does, it demonstrates a real principle, that the human mind can extend itself in various ways. And which is what Shakespeare did with his players, with his drama. He took a lot of things together, put them together, and used chorus as a way to make a unity of effect among these different things. I think that's the direction which we have to think in now. We have to think of those kinds of things. There's a lot more that could be said in that direction, but I think that's where we are at this point. We're going to have to learn to bring the influence of us, especially the influence of us, in these areas within, say, the Mars orbit and beyond. And that should be our immediate mission, because we have to control this whole area. We can't control this area by running people out with buses or something out there. No. You've got to put things out there and use the things you put out there as devices by which you communicate and control with the other parts of the same sphere. And once you do that, then you've made a change in principle. We haven't solved the problem of how we're going to deal with the universe on a larger scale. But we have made the first step forward where mankind is no longer dependent upon his physical reach in the simple sense. Right. But man now is able to influence the process, radiate an influence of the process within the solar system and beyond.
That's a pretty big step to make.
Well, that's why I think it's
a good start.
You've got to have a starting point which is competent to deal with what the problems of mankind are. And I think that's it. My particular attraction is this Mars thing. The idea of sending people to Mars is rather stupid in the way it's being presented, and particularly the way it's being presented. Mm-hmm. What we need to do is to control processes on Mars from Earth. Now, we know what that means. We can put things out there which radiate. We can do all kinds of things. And what we have to do is get a different view of this whole matter, the view that we, from Earth, are going to be able to control the decisions made in the solar system in a larger domain. And under that kind of control, we're going to be able to make things work for us. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to break out of these old habits. We are reaching the limit with these kinds of conceptions. We're reaching beyond the limits of what man can do in that way. So the point is to recognize if that way is not the appropriate way, what is the way? Mm-hmm. Well, the way is to create a system which you can build on, like you're going to control in a sense, and you can bring parts of the inner part of this solar system, between Earth and Mars in particular, you can bring that thing under some kind of control, or by influence, which has the effect of control. And that's much more convenient for mankind than trying to travel out there yourself.
It's a much more effective way of bringing out identity there. I mean, as opposed to sending a couple of schmucks there on a go-kart to just die when they land.
Yeah, they just...
because, there's an actual purpose to developing a power over our surroundings. I mean, sometimes it's easy to forget about the threat of asteroids since you don't exactly see them every day. Although, it seems like every 6 months or so we see one, pretty big one, coming towards us.
Yeah.
But the only way we're going to have an ability to ensure our survival is by bringing that power of the human mind into an increasing area of the solar system, of our surroundings.
Yeah.
And that, as a goal, is something that's something you can marshal nations together around, and it demands breakthroughs on fusion, breakthroughs in resolving some of these paradoxes that, Cody, you were discussing in the beginning. The only way we're going to be able to develop the power to be able to deal with these things. You know, it's as though the gods of Olympus would rather get struck by an asteroid as long as they get to sit on top of the mountain than allow a new form of fire to be given to those pesky plebeians down there.
I think the culture of our planet has had major defects, gross defects, and therefore we have got to be critical and clean the garbage up. Let's get rid of these assumptions which really are not fit for use, and let's concentrate on things and problems which are challenges, things which are feasible and which have an optimal feedback for them. Mm-hmm. And I say I think the case of Mars, as I look at it, is the crucial model, the crucial test point. What if we don't concentrate on putting people on Mars, as visitors or otherwise? What if we do what curiosity has demonstrated already as an implicit possibility, because the curiosity is up there still working, and is doing something. It's exploring Mars. Now it's also sending us back reports.
That's very important.
Yeah. And therefore, what does this mean? It means mankind, because mankind put this curiosity up there with the other things that were put up there before. Mm-hmm. And this has demonstrated that we can put things there which will report to us, in effect. And we'll be able to cause them to cause effects from wherever they are. So we simply have to deliver devices, which we can do, into Mars, and we have an operating system there. And from that idea of an operating system, the idea that mankind does not have to touch everything. Mankind can let them to touch in our direction. And that's what we have to think. So why don't we just be content to what we know we can do and start to experiment with it? But change the whole attitude, the reductionist conception of mankind, the failure to see that mankind does not have to travel out there. Mankind can send things to travel out there and get the reports back to us. It's a much better prospect for Mars right now than anything else I've heard. Make some fun.
Yeah. Yeah, the reductionist approach has done nothing more than just reduce man to the level of a beast, really.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Change in culture, or change in identity.
Yeah, exactly.
Good.
I think the possibilities are all there, but it's just to make a matter of realizing that we block ourselves in by making given assumptions. We just assume that's proven the case. When if you just think a little bit, one step more, you realize, hey, that's stupid. Here's the way you can do it.
Right. Okay.
And the question is, how do you understand curiosity, for example? And the understanding of curiosity in terms of Mars is a perfect test to help mankind begin to clean his act up on this question. We should be sending things to Mars, a lot of them. It doesn't cost us that much in terms of what the relative effect is. And you have to put a lot of things up there regularly. You've got to keep supplying things that are going to keep the process on Mars going. And we've demonstrated we can have automated systems of all kinds that we can use on Mars from Earth. And that's what we want to do. We can do that quick. Mm-hmm. We don't have to wait until some clown talks himself into flying up there.
Right. Good. Okay, well, I think this has been a good discussion. we've certainly laid out a lot of approaches to take in terms of the immediate situation right now. I mean, the Congress beat Obama back on Syria thanks to our efforts to encourage them to go in the right direction and the efforts of the American people to make sure that the Congress was acting on that. And right now, look, we need to do any of these things. It's urgent that we get Glass-Steagall passed in this whole shutdown nonsense, and then make serious investments in fusion, in development projects, in cooperation with other nations, in particular looking towards the Pacific as a nice alternative to the transatlantic system. Mm-hmm. So, good. So we'll have more on that. Thanks for joining us this week.
Of the founders of Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology, this is the idea of understanding wholes. How does the mind generate wholes out of what often seem to be maybe discrete pieces? But the mind does not operate in terms of pairwise interaction of discrete pieces. The mind operates according to wholes, ideas. And that was the approach that Max Planck and others saw was necessary to really understanding what's happening in the quantum physical domain, that we had to go to the domain of mind.
I'm Jason Ross. I'll be hosting today, joined in the studio by Cody Jones and, as always, Lyndon LaRouche.
So, what I want to get into, and just use a couple of quotes to flesh this out, is the way this was being approached in the early phases of the quantum physical revolution by the associates of people like Max Planck and Einstein, namely those involved in Gestalt psychology, namely Köhler, Wolfgang Köhler, who was one of Welcome to The New Paradigm for Mankind, a weekly discussion between Lyndon LaRouche and his scientific associates, in which we investigate the true nature of the creative human mind and the ideas necessary for the progress of mankind.
Hello, today is October 9th, 2013, and this is this week's episode.
Wolfgang Köhler, later in his life, a speech he was giving at the American Psychological Association meeting in the United States whenever he was the president. So in discussing some of the breakthroughs that have been made in the domain of Gestalt psychology, he says, incidentally, others were no less interested in this new reading than we were. These other people were eminent physicists. Max Planck once told me that he expected our approach, the approach in Gestalt psychology. And so I'll just use a couple of quotes here just to give you an idea of this was the direction that physics and science was headed in. And of course, this is the direction that people like Bohr and really under the control of people like Bertrand Russell attacked, because this completely flies in the face of your standard Newtonian reductionist approach to physics. So here's an initial quote just to give you an idea of that this is where things were headed. So this is a quote from